Sorry for that delay there, technical gremlins, but thank you to James for getting it all set up for us finally. Now we've just got to do the easy bit and talk. I'm David McDougall, a journalist at Euronews, and joining us today is Dominic Hind, an expert in Sweden at the University of Glasgow, and Lucas Dahlstrom, the Stockholm correspondent for Svenska Yle. That's the Swedish language public broadcaster in Finland, which sounds a lot more complicated than it is. Lucas, you're a foreign correspondent. That's, I guess, how we end up describing you.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I'm a Nordic correspondent for Yle, so I cover Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden.
That's a wonderful patch to have. And in the Nordics, we think a lot about gender equality. And I will say this looks like an all-male panel, but believe me, we tried very hard to get a female journalist or a researcher today. Nobody was available. So we're recognizing gender equality in spirit, at least. Welcome to you both. Välkommen till er båda. Let's just get a quick location check. Dominic, where in Sweden are you today? Oh, we don't have Dominic. So, Lucas, where in? I know you've been traveling. You're on the campaign trail. Where in Sweden are you today?
Yeah, well, I'm in Sölvesborg, a city on the south coast of Sweden. I'm in a car right now outside a burger joint where I'm at with my Danish colleague. So let's hope my audio is fine. But Sölvesborg is one of the Sweden Democrats' strongholds, the nationalist party here in Sweden. And here the support for the party is high, and the party is in charge together with three other parties. And the city is sometimes called a shop. I don't know if it's a shop window in English, but like a workshop for the Sweden Democrats. Ideas that are implemented here is often implemented by the party on national level.
Well,
that's at least what they say.
Well, we are going to get to the Sweden Democrats and others as we go along. But just to set the scene, if anybody doesn't know, Swedes vote next Sunday to choose a new government, and the opinion polls are extremely tight. There's essentially two possible outcomes here: a bloc of centre and left-wing parties headed by Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson's Social Democrats, or a right-wing bloc led quite likely by the far-right Sweden Democrats. Um, Lucas, Sweden is a country split right down the middle here. Is this just how it goes? There's eight or so parties who could get into parliament. They just appeal to about 50% of the population each. Are you surprised by that?
I'm not surprised at all. That's how Swedish politics is. Swedish politics is really interesting, and it's often very tight. When you look back on the last 8 years of Swedish politics, it's been super tight. The Social Democrats have been in charge, but they have had to compromise with the budget, so that the opposition parties have also had their say in the budget process. So it's yeah, it's often super tight, and as you can see this spring as well, where it was super tight if the government would hold or not. It was actually decided by one vote in the end. Amina Kakabaveh, which was a Kurdish person from the left wing in Sweden, she decided that the government could hold. So it's very tight often in Sweden, and it's going to be tight this election as well.
That's
so
very much
exciting.
You're very much reflected in the opinion polls. And Dominic is here with us now. Dominic, we just had a location check there from Lucas, who's down in the south of the country. Where are you today in Sweden? Also on the campaign trail. Don't forget to unmute yourself before you speak.
Hello, David. Thanks for having me. I am in Malmo, which your readers may know is the city at the very bottom of Sweden, which has been very much on the front pages over the last couple of years due to spikes in both migration and urban violence. And Malmo is a big barometer for what's going to happen in Swedish politics more generally, because it's a traditionally working class city with very high migration, but the area around Malmo is extremely conservative and has started to vote for the Sweden Democrats in large numbers as well.
And so you and Lucas are actually in the same part of Sweden today,
Yeah.
I have to say. So maybe you'll link up. He's at a burger joint and you're in Malmo, so maybe you guys get together and compare notes in the afternoon. We were just talking there about how close the opinion polls have been. I mean, it's like razor thin between them. Within the margin of errors, I know that you've been noticing. This is, in many other countries, when you get to election time, one party or the other would be surging ahead, or there would be a clear direction of travel. Can you see any direction of travel here? I mean, I've seen polls where it shows a more favourable outcome for the right-wing bloc, and of course some more favourable for the left-wing bloc. Though I did think it was just sort of inching ahead for Magdalena Andersson and the left bloc. Is that your sense as well?
I mean, from week to week, it changes, and like you say, we're going 1-2% either way. So although Sweden doesn't have a majority system, what we've effectively got is a kind of two-party system where a couple of well, probably about 70,000 votes will swing the election for one bloc or the other. My sense from talking to people is that there is a lot of undecided voters out there still, people who are not sure which way they're going to go. I've spoken to people who previously their entire lives have voted for some of the liberal conservative parties who are considering lending their vote to the centre party because they don't want to see the Sweden Democrats in government, and vice versa. People who have voted Social Democrat who are enchanted by what the Sweden Democrats have on offer. And it's those undecided voters who usually aren't that important because we can look at the trends who really could make the difference here. So, I mean, I would have said that this was looking good for the left a week or so ago, but actually looking at the numbers that we've seen this morning from Swedish public television and other people, I'm not so sure anymore.
Well, let's look at some of those parties and some of the themes that have come up in the election. The Social Democrats, Magdalena Andersson, she is Sweden's first female prime minister. She's really been a rock star of this campaign, but her party hasn't seen an equal surge in the polls. Lucas, have you had a chance to be on the campaign trail with the Social Democrats? Have you talked with Andersson or the people around her? How are they feeling about this campaign? Because it's very tight. We're going to keep saying how tight it is, but what are the people around the Social Democrats saying?
Yeah, well, it is really tight, and yes, I've been speaking to people in the Social Democratic Party, and especially here in Skåne, they are worried about the voters leaving the Social Democrats for the Sweden Democrats. So that's one of the issues for them. However, I think they're super happy with how it turned out after Stefan Löfven, the predecessor of Magdalena Andersson, left the party last fall. Since then, I mean, they're in the opinion polls they have risen, and as you said, Magdalena Andersson is kind of a rock star in Sweden, if you want to say that. I don't know, compared to Sanna Marin, she's maybe not that much of a rock star, but she's still a very popular figure, and she's also the reason why the Social Democrats, maybe, I don't know if Dominic agrees with this, but she's maybe the reason also why the Social Democrats are still the biggest party in Sweden, because it looked quite bad last fall. So yeah, and I mean, she's a tough debater. She got Sweden into, or at least they are now applying for NATO membership, as Finland is, and yeah, she's a popular figure, and they are leaning on her in this campaign very much, and they also want to do this election as a popularity contest between Magdalena Andersson, who they know is a super popular person, and Ulf Kristersson, who is the other prime minister candidate for Moderaterna, which is the traditionally the biggest opposition party.
And Dominic, I know you would agree, especially following your Twitter feed as you've been traveling around the country, it's almost a presidential style campaign the Social Democrats have been running in the way that they featured Magdalena Andersson. At bus stops and posters everywhere. And as Lucas said, she's been, performing really well, I think, in the leaders' debates, the various discussions on Swedish television. They're kind of banking on Andersson as a personality, and it does work because she is very trusted. The opinion polls show that she has a very high trust quotient with voters.
And this is the interesting thing, and it's actually very similar to the Centre Party leader Annie Lööf, who, although they will poll much lower, is liked by people across the political spectrum because of some of her very principled stances on certain issues, in the sense that she is competent and also not narcissistic and self-interested in the way that some other of the leaders are perceived. So, if we do get a majority for what we can broadly call the centre-left, or maybe the progressive bloc, that will probably be down to the personality of the two women in the charge of these parties, actually, rather than their politics. One of the things that I find interesting talking to voters, and I've been traveling across the country for almost 3 months now, is that the average voter is actually not that interested in specific policies. They're very interested in leadership. They're very interested in who they think is going to take Sweden through what people are already experiencing as a very tough time because of inflation and other pressures. So I think the task for the Social Democrats is to stay in government, show that they can solve some of the problems that are out there, and then build on the very good brand that Magdalena Andersson has. Because, as was pointed out there just before, Ulf Kristersson is a man who's tried very, very hard to brand himself, has pumped a lot of money into his leadership campaign, and it hasn't really worked out for him, and his approval ratings are down and his support is down as well. So I think you can really see who the more obvious choice in terms of leadership skills is here. Whether or not that turns into a majority in parliament for the actual politics is another matter.
Well, look, on the flip side of the Social Democrats, and I am really interested in the journey that a voter would have to take ideologically to go from being a Social Democrat supporter to a Sweden Democrat supporter. The flip side of the Social Democrats is the Sweden Democrats. They only got their first member of parliament 12 years ago, and now they're poised to be at least the third biggest party, very likely the second biggest party, eclipsing Ulf Kristersson's moderates, who are the traditional conservative opposition in Sweden. And this is a party that has had its roots very clearly in fascism and ethno-nationalism, and not even that long ago either. You've both been covering that party. You're both down in Skåne for a reason, because it's, I suppose you might say, a heartland in some ways for the Sweden Democrats. Lucas, how do people go from Social Democrat, which I think is always a progressive liberal movement in the Nordic region, whether it's in Finland or Sweden, Norway, Denmark, to the Sweden Democrats with their they're quite EU skeptic, they're anti-immigrant, they talk a lot about the detrimental effect that they think immigration has had on society in Sweden. What is that journey like for people from the Social Democrats to the Sweden Democrats, Lucas?
That's a really interesting question. I actually spoke to a political scientist the other day, Tommy Möller, and he said that it's not that big of a difference between the Social Democrats and the Sweden Democrats when it comes to some policies. So it's mainly the working class and workers, male workers, that have gone from the Social Democrats to the Sweden Democrats. And I actually spoke to one Social Democrat today in Hässleholm, which is also in Skåne. That's a place where the Sweden Democrats are the biggest party, and they actually. The reason why so many people have gone from the Social Democrats to the Sweden Democrats is fear, he said, at least. He said that there's fear of the immigration, fear of immigrants coming to Sweden, and fear of what that can lead to, or what that has led to in those places, that makes these people go from the Social Democrats to the Sweden Democrats. And I don't know if, Dominic, you've been following Swedish politics longer than I have, but it's in a way that the Sweden Democrats can brand themselves as the new Workers' Party, because there's not that many workers that vote for, or not as many as before that votes for the Social Democrats, as it were.
If I can come in on that, I mean, I was in a town called Eskilstuna in central Sweden yesterday, just west of Stockholm, and this is a town which previously had lots of industry, not so much anymore. And I saw a speech by Rickard Jomshof, who's the party secretary for the Sweden Democrats. Now, he was able to stand there in a public square and hold a speech for an hour in which he spent most of his time attacking Islam and talking about the threat of Islamification and radical Islam in Sweden, and how Islam was responsible for a variety of social problems in Sweden and economic problems as well. It would have been unthinkable for this to happen 10 years ago, even, for someone pulling 20% to stand openly on a public square in an election campaign and get a round of applause from the public. So although the Sweden Democrats are not maybe as extreme as they've been in the past, as they have moderated themselves, they've also been able to bring new people on board and to introduce some fairly radical right streams of thought into the mainstream discourse. And it was interesting to be there and talk to protesters, but also to members of the other parties about how and why this came to be. What we've really seen in the economic politics of the Sweden Democrats is an attempt to keep business interests happy. They've become increasingly good at attracting money from richer donors and stealing some of the vote share of the moderate middle class. But they've also been very, very good at having some headline economic policies, particularly on things like pensions for older working people. And the Social Democrats have found that very, very hard to fight against, for the simple reason the Social Democrats, although they are a big party with a huge bureaucracy, they don't have the people on the ground that they used to, and they don't have the penetration into these working class communities that they had 20 or 30 years ago.
And Dominic, in essence, the Sweden Democrats, even with the kind of rhetoric that you heard yesterday in one of these sort of meet the party events that happen in towns, all across Sweden and other Nordic countries at election time, essentially what has happened is that it's become acceptable to vote for a far right party. It's no longer something that people maybe wouldn't admit to, or we don't want to admit to voting or supporting an anti-immigrant party. But the Sweden Democrats and their leader Jimmie Åkesson have made it completely acceptable to be on that far right, which is no longer a fringe. And as you said, attracting money from business, green money. They've been very surprisingly, perhaps, progressive on policies around women's rights and LGBT issues. But that's because they're saying that the immigrants who come from Muslim countries want to, roll back rights on for women and LGBT communities. So there's an agenda there as well. But suddenly it's acceptable to vote for a far right party in a country that had been so liberal and progressive. Has that been a surprise?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's a surprise, because if we roll back to the 70s and 80s, a lot of the social democratic ideology that dominated in Sweden for so long was based around very specific ideas of nation. And, people don't name it very often, but if we go back a few decades, we see that it's actually the liberal and right-wing parties who are slightly more in favor of unchecked immigration because of its effect on the labor market. And even when Sweden joined the EU in the mid-90s, we saw that debate again. But in terms of what we might call the kind of more normative, progressive political views we would expect from the conventional political spectrum, we can see that the whole thing has shifted now. And I was actually in Stockholm last week and speaking to somebody who'd been sitting in Parliament for the Greens. And they said that they were shocked because in the space of about 8 years, they've gone from being part of what you would say was a broad consensus on immigration, human rights, progressive politics, to actually being one of the few parties that's going into this election making it a clear red line. And that tells you quite a lot. And it tells you about how the Sweden Democrats have been able to very carefully insert themselves into the political landscape, as you say, David, by talking about how they want to protect gay rights. They very, very clearly took on an interest in fighting anti-Semitism, which they claim is rife in Muslim communities, and have tried to position themselves as guarantors of Swedish Jews' safety, which is very interesting given their history. And also looking at some of the gay rights stuff. I mean, there is this attempt to really paint, as I said earlier, this Islamic threat, which they say is undermining Sweden, as a threat to the core progressive values of modern Sweden.
And then, Lucas, I touched earlier just there on the leader of the Sweden Democrats, Jimmie Åkesson. What kind of leader is he? What kind of politician is he? Is he charismatic speaker? I mean, he's really reinvented the party or modernized the party and led them to this electoral success. They're on the brink of this, huge election success this week. But what kind of politician is Jimmie Åkesson?
It's hard to say, because in a way they've never been in power, and that's what he always say as well. we've never been in power, so anything that goes wrong in Sweden, it's not our fault. But as a leader,
That's very convenient. It's a very convenient thing to say, isn't it?
it's very convenient, and that's partly why there might be a worry among the Sweden Democrats this year, because they can actually they've always been this establishment party, and now they're going to be maybe in a coalition with the government. So how is that going to affect the party? Who knows? But it's he's a very popular leader among the Sweden Democrats. I mean, he's been their leader since 2005, and I think, and he's really taken the party to a new level. And I don't think that he ever thought that they are going to be this big when he joined the party back in the 90s. So he's a popular guy. I mean, you have to say he's a good politician because he's taken the party so far.
And I don't want to say that Jimmy Åkesson himself is a fascist. However, he joined the party, as you said, back in the 90s, when it really was steeped in that ethno-nationalism, and it would be what we recognize now as a neo-Nazi party. How does he draw that distinction between the past and where he is now, do you think? I mean, do you think he draws it clearly enough for voters or for an international audience?
I don't think the voters of the Sweden Democrats today care so much about the past. That's maybe what you may say is a problem in a way. But yeah, he draws the line in a way that he says that they cleaned out the past, and they this year they published a book about their past as well. Where they clearly stated that there had been some neo-Nazis in the party before, but they tried to make them disappear from the party. So it's he draws a line where he says that there's no racism allowed in the party, and they're gonna how do you say expel anyone who's a racist in the party. But of course, there are elements of that in the party still. They are in a way more accepted today by other parties, of course, than before. But there's still, as you said yesterday with Richard Jomshof as well, there are still elements of the past in the party, and that's one thing that makes them popular among those circles as well. And you always get these scandals with the Swedish Democrats. But when I talk to political scientists, they say that the Sweden Democrats have changed a lot since the 90s. But there's still something, there's still something left of the old party. Of course, you can't really wash away your past that easily.
Yeah, Lucas, you and I are talking about the Sweden Democrats there, but that strikes me that everything you said is applicable to the Finns party in Finland. But that's another Nordic Twitter Spaces. Yeah. Dominic, do you maybe explain to us how that messaging has changed from the 90s, that message of nationalism between then and now? Do you think there's enough of a distinction being made? Has a clear line been drawn by Åkesson and other members of the party?
I mean, I think it's been a long and slow process, and Åkesson has been very careful to do this. He took over essentially from a much more explicitly, I would say, ethno-nationalist leader. At a time when the party, really wasn't going anywhere. So he was able to use his force of personality and the fact he had a group of friends around him who helped him on his journey to get hold of the party when it had very few members and to turn them into an electoral force at local level, and then obviously breaking into national parliament. If we look at where the Sweden Democrats were in the early and mid 1990s, they were publishing manifestos which today would be considered as borderline neo-Nazi, even though they weren't necessarily explicitly Nazi in a kind of aesthetic way. The thing about the Sweden Democrats that is really interesting is the way that they've been very good at having quite vague policies, and when things don't conflict with their central ideology, they've been very quick to adapt what they see as populist policy or popular policy. So that's why we can also say, as well as being a neo-right party, they're also a populist party. And that's a big part of their success. My reading of the situation, having followed the development over the last kind of 15 years, is that the party leadership is still actually quite unreformed. If we look at people like Rikard Jomshof, but also Björn Söder and some of the other senior figures around Jimmie Åkesson, these are all long-time members who have been kind of cooking in the ideological pot there for some time. So even if some of the younger members and the voters themselves don't share those views, we have to be mindful of the fact the party leadership is very much the same as it was 20 years ago, pretty much. Now, what is really interesting about that is that if this is a strategy of normalization that they have taken, they hope that once they have their hands on the machinery of power and can push a few buttons, they'll then be able to bring people with them. And it's very, very hard right now to actually say what party people will get, because an emboldened Sweden Democrat Party with a good electoral result behind it might well feel that it can say and do different things to what it's been able to say on the campaign trail.
Well, if you're just joining us, it's great to have you listening into our Euronews Twitter space about the Swedish general election. I'm David McDougall, a journalist at Euronews with a focus on the Nordic region. And joining me today is Dominic Hind, who you just heard there, an expert in Sweden at the University of Glasgow, and Lucas Dahlström, the Stockholm correspondent for Svenska Yle, that's a Swedish language public broadcaster in Finland. And if you have a question for Dominic or Lucas, please send us a tweet just underneath the main Twitter Spaces tweet on our Euronews account, and our producer James is looking out for those. So we've been discussing the Social Democrats and the Sweden Democrats. Let's touch on a couple of the other parties here. The Moderate Party, led by Ulf Kristersson, is the traditional biggest conservative opposition party in Sweden. They've really been losing ground. It's very obviously losing ground to the Swedish Democrats, who have pulled the political discussion and some of the media coverage as well to the right. If Ulf Kristersson, I guess I'll go to Lucas first. If Ulf Kristersson takes his party into third place here and is eclipsed by the Sweden Democrats, can he keep his job, or will he have to go, do you think?
Well, that depends. That depends on the election outcome. If his bloc, consisting of the Liberals, consisting of the Christian Democrats, and consisting of the Swedish Democrats, if they are the biggest bloc after the election, then he will become prime minister if he can form a government, because Jimmie Åkesson won't have the power over the other parties to form a government. So he is their prime minister, the candidate. So if he becomes prime minister, even
if the Sweden Democrats get more MPs, Jimmie Åkesson just doesn't have that the clout, the authority to have the other parties follow along where he would be prime minister.
Exactly, and he knows that as well, and he has said it publicly. He wants to be a part of the government, but I think that he can also be that the Sweden Democrats can be in a supportive role, even though they are the second biggest party in Swedish politics. It will be hard for them, of course, and they will want to have a lot of their politics in this new government if Ulf Kristersson becomes prime minister. If, however, the right bloc, or whatever you want to call it, loses the election, and Magdalena Andersson and the Social Democrats stay in power for 12 years instead of 8 years that they've already been, then I would say that Ulf Kristersson has to go, because this election has been I wouldn't say catastrophe so far, because there's the election has not yet been held. But it's, I mean, the when you look at the questions raised during this election campaign, it is questions that the moderates they should win this election. Let's say it like that, because we talk about, firstly, it's been 8 years of social democratic rule. The gang crime rate in Sweden, I mean, it creates headlines outside of Sweden as well. And it's been, the other issues has been energy, immigration. I mean, these are issues that the moderates they should win this election. So I mean, if he doesn't become prime minister after the election, I'm sure that the moderates will think about it, and maybe he will leave on the election night. Who knows?
And talking of some of those issues there, I mean, the campaign really has been dominated by issues that are the traditional ground of the right and the far right: immigration and law and order, crime. Dominic, have other issues even been able to break through as much as those kind of the ones that are led by the right. Because when we talk about crime or law and order in Sweden, we're talking about immigrant crime and immigrant law and order, aren't we? We're not talking about nice white Swedish people.
No, we're not, generally speaking. And there is a lot of crime in Sweden that goes on that is committed by white Swedish people, including white collar crime, of which there is surprisingly a large amount in Sweden. I think that the thing to understand about the migrant crime wave, as it's been styled, is that it's usually concentrated in very specific pockets of very specific cities. So what we've seen is a move from Sweden, which in the mid 1980s was the most equal country in the developed world, so outside of the Soviet Union, basically in China, to a situation where we have these pockets of almost endemic poverty that look much more like what you would find in Britain or in France or in parts of Germany now. And Swedish politics hasn't really found a way to respond to that. And so the response from voters has been to find the solutions that are offered by the far right for the most part, and also by the moderates who've taken an increasingly hard line on law and order. I think that when you look at what the actual problems are in Sweden today, I mean, there are huge problems with healthcare in Sweden at the moment, which people complain about, which haven't really made their way into the election properly. Several Swedish cities and regions have had issues with hospitals being closed, privatization of services, which has been a disaster, and long waiting times, people having to give birth in hospital corridors, these kinds of things, which in the UK and elsewhere people maybe are a bit more accustomed to. But for Swedes, this is a big shock, and the sheer scale of migration and crime as an election issue has meant that these other things haven't really come to the table.
And you'd think for a social democrat government that's been in power for the last 8 years, issues around integration and immigration, healthcare and social services, that would be considered perhaps their bread and butter. And if there still is, not being able to form, make that the part of the conversation where it's dominated by what the parties on the right want to talk about, shows a certain weakness, I would think, in thematic leadership from the Social Democrats and others on the left.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what you have to understand, and I think this is fairly well known actually, is that the Social Democrats built modern Sweden. So really from the 1920s all the way through to the 1990s, they absolutely dominated politics with a couple of short and fairly shaky interruptions. And so many of the institutions that Swedes take for granted today were built by the Social Democrats. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to carry on voting for the Social Democrats. And having been the party of grand visions and of what in Sweden people sometimes call framtidslandet, so the land of the future, they now really lack an overall vision for what Sweden is going to be and what its place is in the world. And that is a really big problem for them. I think existentially, they are in a very difficult place with no answers.
And Lucas, another issue that hasn't really broken through in the same way that you might have expected if you're an observer from looking at Sweden from the outside is green issues, the climate crisis. Now, nuclear power is on the agenda, but in context of an energy price crisis. We had Greta Thunberg this week saying there's not enough discussion about environmental issues. And this is from the country that brought the world new words for flight shame or climate strike, the Fridays for Future campaign. The Greens do look like they're on course to do better than ever in an election.
Yeah. Are you still there?
We're here.
Okay, sorry. I can't hear. Was there a question, David? Because I just thought that the Greens is a really interesting party to follow, because I did a story about them this spring also when it looked like they would drop out of the parliament, because you need to get over the 4%. You need to get more than 4% of the votes in Sweden to get into the parliament, and it looked like they were actually dropping out in the midst of a climate crisis. So yes, that's also an issue that hasn't been covered as much as you would have thought, and that maybe maybe that's because of the war in Ukraine. Maybe that's because of the fuel prices going up. That you can't really have this discussion in Sweden now. If you want to get voters on your side, you don't want to talk the Paris Agreement when you can't talk about fuel prices going up.
That's very true. And I think we just have a moment to bring in James, who has a question for us, I think. James?
Yes, I do. Thanks, David. So I think some of our listeners want to know, why exactly is this election important for Europe and Europeans outside of Sweden? Why should we as a continent care?
Oh, I think that's definitely one for Dominic, who I know has an answer for this.
Yeah, I think the thing to understand about Sweden is that it's always been a bit of a laboratory rather for the future of progressive politics. And when the Swedish liberal conservatism had its high point in the mid-2000s, a huge amount of that policy was exported and gave the green light for similar movements around Europe. And if we go back to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, Sweden then, from a left-wing perspective, functioned as a model for how other countries might be. I think if Sweden takes a much more reactionary right-wing turn in terms of its national politics and its migration politics, that actually sends a signal out to the rest of Europe as well about where the kind of red lines are and what's acceptable. Sweden has always been a very good barometer for where Europe is going, I think. And I think if we have an unusually right-wing Swedish government, so I should emphasize this would probably be the most right-wing Swedish government since the early part of the 20th century. That would, I think, change the way people perceive Sweden, and also change Sweden's relationships with other countries as well. So this is a critical, I suppose, benchmark really for what's possible if this most progressive of all countries supposedly ends up having a very, very right-wing settlement.
And Lucas, your audience, who you're reporting for, is in Finland, and of course there's a vested interest there because of shared language and some shared history, but also shared geography. But why do you think people outside of your core audience should care about this election, or should maybe sit up and take notice of what's happening in Sweden?
Well, we usually say that things that happen in Sweden happens 10 years after in Finland. So it's
although in this case it's the other way around.
I was just coming to that point, that we actually had the far right party in the government in Finland a couple of years ago. So well, I can only agree with what Dominic said. It's a barometer for us as well. And the Sweden Democrats are so different in a way than the true Finns in Finland, just because of their background as well. So and also I would say, I've actually spoken to experts on this as well. The whole rhetoric in Sweden has changed during the past years. It's become more right wing. It's become more nationalist. If you listen to Magdalena Andersson, for example, she speaks almost like a moderate Sweden Democrat in some of her speeches. So that's also something that we could look out for in Finland. Will this be something that happens with our Social Democratic Party as well?
And then just finally, if I could put you both on the spot on predictions for Sunday, if you dare, Dominic, how?
Oh, you've gone, David.
David's gone.
I will carry on with that prediction until he gets back. I think that we, looking at the numbers today, looking at speaking to people, I want to believe maybe that there is a chance of maybe a single seat majority for the nominally progressive bloc, but that because of the way that the seat allocation works in Sweden and the way that the smaller parties are allocated seats as well, even that could be quite complex. And we could be in a situation, if it's very tight, where we don't actually have a final confirmed result until a day or so after, when all of the votes are counted, unlike what it usually is in Sweden, where we have a fairly good idea straight away.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the numbers, it changes day after day. It's not all. It's like when they give out opinion polls in Sweden every day, and it changes every single day. So it's going to be super tight. And I thought with this spring, I thought that the right bloc, if you want to say so, will take this election. But now I'm not so sure. Let's see. But it's going to be super interesting and super tight.
Yeah, and it's also worth saying that whoever wins this election, there's no guarantee that their government will last. Both blocs are actually quite ideologically disparate, and it's not necessarily guaranteed that the Conservative bloc would be able to sustain its majority over 4 years without having significant disagreements, and the same for the left bloc.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So,
just while we try and get David back, Lucas, can you give us your predictions?
Yeah, I think I said already that I can't give a prediction because it's so super tight. It's as I said this spring, I thought that it might be the right wing or the right bloc that takes home this election, but I'm not so sure anymore. It's I mean, it changes every day, the opinion polls, but I'll go for the what I thought this spring, and then let's see on Sunday.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that, Lucas. And that's all from our Twitter Spaces today about the Swedish election. Thank you very much to our guests, Lucas Dahlstrom and Dominic Hind, and to producer James Thomas for making sure everything runs smoothly behind the scenes. If you missed anything, you can listen again right here on Twitter. And you can follow all our election coverage from Sweden at our website, euronews.com, and on our social media channels, including analysis of the vote results next Monday morning. Thanks, and bye for now.